June 1944 was a pivotal month in World War II. Well known for the largest single amphibious operation in history, the invasion of Normandy was a monumental risk that resulted in a critical success. Despite its size and significance, however, D-Day represented only a fraction of the effort expended worldwide. This video takes a global tour of the military events of June 1944, showing where D-Day fits in with the rest of the war that month. It's intended for a general audience, although historians will be interested in tools digital technology brings to well-known stories. Two European fronts critically impacted D-Day. By far, the bulk of the fighting and casualties in World War II occurred on the Eastern Front, where Axis partners spent nearly 4 years locked in a life-or-death struggle with the Red Army. In June 1944, the majority of German divisions faced east. The Red Army coiled for a new offensive, and the Germans braced for it. Stalin hoped an invasion of France would draw Axis divisions westward. With 120 Red Army divisions amassing in Belarus, Hitler knew better than to withdraw too many. We'll start with an animation of the fighting up to June to set the stage. German initiatives in green and Soviet initiatives in red. Quickly overrunning the Western Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, the Germans were stopped at Moscow and Leningrad. The Soviet government didn't collapse as expected, and 2 days before Pearl Harbor, the Red Army launched a winter counteroffensive against the ill-prepared Germans, making limited gains. By April, spring mud stopped everything, and the Germans paused to prepare another offensive. The Second Great German Offensive carried them as far as the Caucasus and Stalingrad by November 1942. There, the Red Army reversed directions. The Axis attack on the Kursk salient in July 1943 was the last major German offensive of the Eastern Front. The Red Army was ready, and it retained the initiative the rest of the war. May and early June 1944 brought another pause, and the Red Army launched its next offensive on June 22nd, the third anniversary of Hitler's Barbarossa. In the timeline, we see the intensity of events, with peaks in December 42 and September 43. Using the time wheel to look only at attacks initiated by the Germans, we see they clearly favored summer months for their offensives. The Soviets preferred the opposite. The Battle of the Atlantic affected D-Day as well, because protecting shipping was the only way to get troops, weapons, and supplies from the United States to the beaches of Normandy. By June 1944, Allied improvements in technology, training, and techniques, combined with long-range aircraft, had changed the Battle of the Atlantic from the U-boats destroying merchant shipping to the U-boats being destroyed. During June, U-boats fleeing French Atlantic ports became targets. A total of 26 U-boats were lost that month, including the U-505 captured off Africa. The Allies invaded the European mainland in September 1943 when, having cleared North Africa and Sicily, Operations Torch and Husky respectively, they landed in Italy. This drew several German divisions south and precipitated Italy's surrender that same month. Allied progress was slow and costly, but by June they threatened Rome. Allied forces entered Rome on June 4th, 2 days before D-Day. By the 6th, they were 40 miles further north, and over the month they surged north to fill a 100-mile gap as the Germans fought rearguard actions and retired to the well-defended Gothic line. The Normandy invasion and beachhead breakout required 2 years of planning and preparation. Over 6,000 ships moved millions of tons of supplies and 1 million men over the beaches in the first month. General Eisenhower was responsible for the decision for when to launch the invasion. As the Allies flooded into Rome on the morning of June 4th, weather forced Eisenhower and England to postpone the invasion. That evening, he set the wheels in motion for June 6th. Airborne units landed first, with the British 6th Airborne Division to the east, followed 40 minutes later by 2 U.S. Airborne Divisions, which took a course to the west. Most units missed their drop zones but still accomplished their missions. Seaborne assaults on Gold, Sword, Juneau, and Utah beaches went as expected, but there was fierce fighting before Omaha Beach was cleared. By the end of June 6th, some Allied units stopped several miles inland. Men, equipment, and supplies rapidly amassed ashore. By July, the flow of troops and supplies, supported by artificial harbors and naval gunfire, allowed the troops to firmly establish the beachhead. The Allies by this point in the war had effective control of the sea and air in northern and southern Europe. Tactical and strategic bombing by thousands of Allied aircraft around Normandy, and on days with good weather deep into Germany, light blue diamonds on the map, made movement by German reinforcements extremely difficult. U.S. Air Forces mounted shuttle raids over Germany and Eastern Europe to newly opened airfields inside the Soviet Union. The end of the month saw American ground progress reach Cherbourg and St. Lo in the west, while to the east, British and Canadian troops struggled to take Caen as more men and material piled ashore. Moving to the Pacific, we see Allied-initiated events in blue, Japanese in orange. Envisioning History's Palantir interface allows us to appreciate the scale of two strategic defeats handed to the Japanese during this period. Japan's strategic aims included the capture of oil reserves in the East Indies and the development of a defensive perimeter in the Central Pacific. Notice the blue arc extending northwest from the Japanese base at Rabaul all the way to Hainan Island off China. In the histogram, we see that part of the arc is General MacArthur's New Guinea campaign. From there to China, the arc consists primarily of U.S. submarine actions with help from British submarines in the Java area. The combined effect was to isolate mainland Japan from the resources of the East Indies and to neutralize outer defensive perimeter bases at Truk, Rabaul, and Cameron Bay. In New Guinea, General MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area strategy was to leapfrog significant enemy concentrations. Taking the Admiralty Islands and then Hollandia on the north coast in early 1944 allowed General Kruger's forces in June to secure places with unfamiliar names like Lone Tree Hill, Wakde, Yakamul, Biak, and Noom 4. These set the stage for the next move to the Vogelkopf, or Bird's Head, on western New Guinea, the last step before MacArthur's return to the Philippines. Having isolated Truk by taking the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, the next move in the Central Pacific was to capture the Marianas Islands. The first assault was on Saipan, followed in July by nearby Tinian and Guam. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, under Admiral Raymond Spruance, amphibious forces led by Admiral Richmond K. Turner, and Marines by General Holland M. Smith, were ready. While on the other side of the world, the massive D-Day operation was only a week old, underwater demolition teams probed and cleared Saipan's beaches. A massive bombardment by battleships and aircraft then prepared the way for the landing on June 15th. Marines and soldiers fanned out to capture the island against suicidal Japanese resistance. Japan considered Saipan part of its sacred territory. Politically, it couldn't afford to let the Marianas fall. But Saipan's loss was more than an important symbolic defeat. The island could provide a base of operations from which American B-29s could bomb Japan. In an effort to forestall the significant blow, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched Operation Eigo to drive American forces from the region. Admiral Ozawa's fleet was outnumbered in every category of ship, including aircraft carriers. Ozawa had 9 carriers against the Americans' 15, and his attack failed completely. Instead of ending the American capture of the Marianas, it hastened the collapse of Japan's naval presence in the Central Pacific. The 2 days of aerial combat became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by naval aviators because of the massive losses of Japanese aircraft and crews, and 3 carriers sunk. Now only 1 Japanese carrier remained that had attacked Pearl Harbor. In June 1944, the bulk of Japan's land forces were still held in China and Manchuria. Allied efforts to supply Chiang Kai-shek's China through the back door by flying supplies over the hump of the Himalayas and by building the Burma and Lido roads from India into China were a war-long struggle. British Commonwealth forces, primarily Indian, were still fighting to secure the Indian city of Imphal. Meanwhile, Commonwealth and U.S. irregular forces, Chinese army divisions, and accompanying Allied aircraft fought to take the town of Mitkaina in Burma and the Salween Valley in western China. Further east, Imperial Japanese Army divisions fought Chinese ground forces, Sako irregulars, and Allied air forces to capture and maintain control of areas along the front between Japanese and Chinese nationalist control. It's well to recall this often forgotten area of war. Since World War II started in China in 1937, second only to the Soviet Union, China suffered massive casualties and fighting continued up to the Japanese surrender over a year after June 1944. Also of impending importance in June was the first U.S. B-29 attack against the Japanese home islands. This was a test staged from China, and these raids wouldn't reach their full fury until Saipan and Tinian were fully established as air bases in 1945. We've looked at the major military actions of June 1944. It's also important to look at the distances involved in supporting these operations. The United States claimed the title of the Arsenal of Democracy, but the products of factories had to be moved to the fronts, and chains of bases had to be constructed to handle them. Most supplies moved by ship at some point. The Great Circle distance from Norfolk, Virginia to Normandy, without intermediate stops, is 6,000 kilometers, or about 3,600 miles. From San Francisco to Hollandia, without intermediate stops, is almost twice the distance. Producing supplies in factories, then maintaining steady flows of beans, bullets, and black oil, followed by distribution, combat loading for amphibious operations, and steady replenishment of forces afloat and ashore was a larger task in material terms than the combat operations. We hope you've gained an appreciation of the events of June 1944, a critical point during one of the most cataclysmic events in human history.